Attention! Are you ready to witness the fall of a king and the rise of a queen? Subscribe now and hit that notification bell. The Wallflower's revenge. He owned the skyline, but she owned the truth. He was the master of the city's skyline, yet he couldn't stand the sight of his own wife. Julian Black, an industry titan, saw Audrey Vance as nothing more than a necessary, but deeply embarrassing, part of a corporate merger. He called her plain, a ghost in his golden mansion, a wallflower he actively hid from the public eye. But a ghost can still hear. And after one final crushing insult, Audrey decided the wallflower was about to bloom. She embarked on a secret transformation, preparing for one single night, the Zenith Gala, to show her husband and the world exactly who they had underestimated. The marriage deal. Blackwood's asset. Julian Black had not married a woman. He had acquired a crucial asset. Audrey Vance was the biological key to the successful merger between Blackwood Holdings and Vance Pharma, a deal brokered by their fathers on a golf course years before either of them had a say in the matter. The pact was unbreakable. The union of their companies would be sealed with the union of their children. Julian gained controlling shares of a pharmaceutical empire, and Audrey gained the Blackwood surname and a cage, albeit a golden one. The penthouse on Park Avenue in New York City was less a home and more a museum of Julian's success. It was a cold expanse of marble, glass, and steel, with panoramic views of a city that adored him. And in this vast manifestation of his power, Audrey was the ghost. She was quiet, discreet, and in Julian's cutting opinion, painfully plain. She had intelligent hazel eyes that saw everything, but she kept them lowered. Her ash-brown hair was often pulled back in a simple, severe bun, and her wardrobe consisted of a rotation of beige, gray, and navy cardigans, and unassuming skirts that seemed designed to make her disappear into the expensive wallpaper. Julian was a man carved from ambition and arrogance, with sharp, dark features, a physique sculpted by personal trainers, and a collection of Savile Row suits. He commanded attention wherever he went. He thrived in the spotlight, his name a constant presence in the pages of Forbes and Vogue. His wife, however, was his secret shame. In the 3 years of their marriage, he had never willingly taken her to a major public event. On the rare occasions when her presence was unavoidable, he introduced her with a dismissive hand gesture. "This is Audrey," before immediately redirecting his attention to someone more important, more beautiful, more interesting. The casual cruelty was not always so public. More often, it was a daily series of small, sharp cuts. "For God's sake, Audrey, are you wearing that again?" he scoffed as she came down for breakfast, her simple gray dress a stark contrast to his immaculate Tom Ford suit. "You have a limitless black card. Try to look like you're married to me, not my accountant." She would only murmur a quiet, "I'm comfortable," which only seemed to enrage him further. "Comfort is the luxury of people who don't have to be looked at," he would retort, without even looking up from his tablet. His cruelty was casual, an unthinking byproduct of his immense ego. He never considered her feelings, because to him, she wasn't a whole person. She was a contractual obligation, a piece of living furniture. He had no idea she had graduated summa cum laude from Wharton with a finance degree, that she spoke 3 languages fluently, or that she found solace in reading Russian literature in its original text late at night when the cavernous penthouse was silent. He never asked. 2. The final insult. Wrapping paper. The Zenith Gala, the upcoming Metropolis Charity Gala, was the peak of the New York social calendar, an event Julian considered his personal stage. This year, Blackwood Holdings was the lead sponsor. His attendance was non-negotiable, and to his deep irritation, so was his wife's. Board members, particularly the older, more traditional ones from the Vance side, had been making comments about her absence from previous functions. It looked bad, they said. It looked, to be specific, like trouble in the billionaire's perfect marriage. He brought it up one evening, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a glass of scotch in his hand. "The gala is the 1st of next month. You'll be coming with me." Audrey looked up from her book, her expression unreadable. Oh, she hadn't known. "Well, now you do," he said curtly. "My PR team believes it's imperative that we present a united front." He swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "I've asked my assistant to contact a stylist. Her name is Celine. She'll be here tomorrow at 10. For God's sake, listen to her. Don't argue. Just let her turn you into something presentable." He didn't see the flash of hurt in her hazel eyes. Or perhaps he did, and simply didn't care. To him, this was a problem to be managed. His simple wife needed to be polished, like tarnished silver, before she could be displayed. "Of course, Julian," she said, her voice a soft whisper, the vast room, easily swallowed. He nodded curtly, satisfied. He drank his scotch and left the room without another word, leaving her alone with the city lights and the weight of his casual disdain. Audrey closed her book, the words on the page blurred. She walked to the window, looking at the endless stream of bright, bustling lights. Everyone down there lived a life full of choices and feelings, of heartbreaks and joys. She was up here, higher than all of them, in a silent, sterile palace, more isolated than any of them could imagine. For 3 years, she had endured. For 3 years, she had made herself small and invisible, hoping that if she drew no attention, she could at least find peace. But his demand that she be presentable was not just an insult. It was an order to be a dollar store accessory on his arm for one night. He didn't want her. He wanted a sanitized, approved version of her. And as she looked at her faint reflection in the glass, a quiet, cold resolution began to form deep in her heart. He wanted something presentable. Fine. He would get it. But it wouldn't be on his terms. It would be on hers. Later that week, the final straw came. It wasn't a direct hit, but a glancing one, overheard by chance, and all the more painful for it. Julian was hosting an informal business dinner in his private dining room. Audrey, as usual, had made herself invisible, retreating to the library adjacent to the space. The heavy oak doors were almost closed, but a small gap remained, and the voices, lubricated by expensive wine, drifted through. She heard the booming laughter of Marcus Cross, Julian's main business rival. Cross was everything Julian was, but with a veneer of old money charm that Julian's new money aggression could never replicate. Their rivalry was legendary in New York financial circles. "I have to say, Julian," Cross's smooth voice drifted through the door, "you've played the long game brilliantly. Securing Vance Pharma was a masterstroke. Too bad about the accessories." Julian's friends laughed. Audrey's breath caught in her throat. She knew they were talking about her. "She is a means to an end, Marcus. Nothing more." Julian's voice was slick with condescension. He was performing for his audience. "The deal stands. The wife is useful for maintaining the family connection to the board. But let's be honest, she's a drag. A complete zero in the charisma department. Keeping her out of the spotlight is a full-time job." Someone else chimed in. "Come on, Julian. At least you could have married one with some sparkle." "The wrapping paper is irrelevant," Julian replied, and the finality of his tone was like a physical slap. "I bought the company, not the wrapping paper. As long as she stays quiet and doesn't embarrass me, she's fulfilling her part of the bargain." The laughter that followed was a physical blow. Audrey shrank, clapping her hands over her mouth to stifle a gasp. A drag. The wrapping paper. He hadn't just said it to her in a moment of anger. He had told his rival, his friends, as a point of pride. He was boasting about how little she meant to him. In that moment, something inside her didn't just break. It shattered, and the pieces began to reassemble into something new, something hard and sharp. The silent acceptance she had cultivated for 3 years evaporated, replaced by a cold, clear fury. She had been a ghost in his house, a footnote in his life, a contractual obligation he barely tolerated. No more. She backed away from the door in silence, her movements graceful and sure. She went to her bedroom, the one on the opposite end of the penthouse from Julian's, and sat at her antique desk. She opened a small hidden drawer and pulled out a worn leather journal. It had belonged to her mother, a woman who, before her illness, had been a force of nature, brilliant, elegant, and unapologetically herself. Audrey flipped through the pages until she found the name she was looking for. Isabel Ricci. Rome. Isabel had been her mother's closest confidant, a legendary figure whispered about in the highest echelons of European society. She wasn't just a stylist. She was a sculptor of personalities, an artist who worked not in clay or stone, but in confidence, posture, and presence. She had retired years ago, disappearing from public life to live a secluded life in Italy, rejecting all clients. Audrey picked up her phone. She didn't hesitate. She knew it was a risky move, but the fire Julian had just ignited in her gut burned too intensely to ignore. She wouldn't be presentable. She wouldn't be a doll dressed by his stylist. She would be a masterpiece of her own making. 3. The metamorphosis. The wrapping paper burns. The next day, she dismissed a bewildered Celine, telling her simply that her services were no longer needed. She then informed Julian that she would handle her own arrangements for the gala. He barely looked up from his desk. "Fine. Just don't show up in one of your gray cardigans. I'll be embarrassed enough as it is." He was so confident in his perception of her that he couldn't conceive of her doing anything of significance. His disinterest provided the perfect cover. Isabel Ricci was not what Audrey expected. She wasn't a whirlwind of air kisses and fashion jargon. She was a woman in her late 60s, with deep, penetrating dark eyes, a mane of silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun, and an aura of absolute authority. She arrived via the service entrance with a single suitcase and surveyed the penthouse with an expression of profound disapproval. "This place has no soul," she declared. "It's a vault with a view. No wonder you hide." Her work began not in a closet, but in Audrey's mind. For the first few days, they didn't look at a single item of clothing. They talked. Isabel made Audrey recount everything: her childhood, her love of numbers and literature, her forgotten ambitions, the slow, crushing weight of her marriage. "You have made yourself invisible as a shield," Isabel concluded one afternoon. "You believe if they don't see you, they can't hurt you. But a shield can also be a cage. Audrey, you've locked yourself inside." The training was rigorous and holistic. Isabel was a drill sergeant, dressed in Dior. They started with posture. Shoulders back. Your ancestors were not spineless. Walk as if you own the ground you walk on, not as if you are apologizing for taking up space. Audrey spent hours pacing the long hallway with a stack of books on her head until her timid shuffle transformed into a graceful, confident stride. Then came her voice. Isabel made her read poetry aloud, projecting from her diaphragm. "Your voice is a whisper. A whisper is for secrets and prayers, not for the boardroom or the ballroom. Speak as if you expect to be heard." Her soft murmurs slowly gained timbre and strength, becoming measured and clear. The hidden fortune and the enigma dress. As Isabel reshaped her presence, Audrey secretly rebuilt her independence. Years ago, she had inherited a modest but respectable stock portfolio from her grandmother. Julian, after a cursory glance, had dismissed it as pocket money and forgotten about it entirely. But Audrey, with her Wharton education and a brilliant, unexplored financial mind, had been meticulously managing it. In the privacy of her study late at night, she wasn't just reading Tolstoy. She was analyzing market trends, making bold, calculated investments in tech startups and emerging biotech firms. Her pocket money had quietly grown into a substantial fortune, a secret nest egg that gave her a growing sense of power. It was her escape plan long before she knew she was planning an escape. Finally, a week before the gala, Isabel tackled the wrapping paper. They didn't look for trends. They sought a statement. "It is not about being beautiful," Isabel explained, sketching designs in a notebook. "Julian is surrounded by beautiful. It is common. It is cheap. This is about being unforgettable. We will create an enigma when you walk into that room. They must not say, 'She is beautiful.' They must say, 'Who is she?'" They commissioned a dress from a reclusive, avant-garde designer from Antwerp, whose work was closer to art than fashion. It was a breathtaking creation of midnight blue silk that seemed to absorb the light around it, architecturally structured, yet flowing with an ethereal grace. It was elegant, powerful, and utterly unique. It was a dress that did not wear the woman. The woman had to inhabit it. The physical transformation was the final piece. A top-tier hairstylist, sworn to secrecy, was flown in from Paris. He cut her ash-brown hair, layering it to frame her face, and dyed it a warm, deep chestnut with subtle mahogany highlights. A makeup artist, a legend in the editorial world, showed her how to accentuate her high cheekbones and define her large, intelligent hazel eyes, making them the striking focal point of her face. The afternoon of the gala, Audrey looked at her reflection. The woman looking back was a stranger, yet, paradoxically, the most honest version of herself she had ever seen. The plainness was gone, stripped away to reveal the strength that had been there all along. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, serene determination. Isabel stood behind her, a rare, proud smile on her face. "There you are, darling," she said softly. "I wondered when you would show up." Audrey smiled back, a true, confident smile that reached her eyes. "Julian expects a wallflower," she said, her voice low and resonant. "He's about to get a wildfire." Interactive question. Do you think Audrey's transformation was merely external, or was the internal shift in confidence the most powerful part of her preparation? Comment below. 4. The Gala. The Wildfire. The Zenith Gala was an exercise in ostentatious grandeur. The entrance to the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA, was a river of camera flashes and velvet ropes. Julian Black arrived early and alone. He thrived in this environment, moving through the crowd with the predatory grace of a shark. He wore a custom Brioni tuxedo, the dark fabric a perfect contrast to his ruthless ambition. He greeted politicians, exchanged polite barbs with business rivals, and posed for the cameras with an easy, practiced smile. Several people asked about his wife. "Where is Audrey tonight, Julian?" asked a portly banking CEO. Julian sighed dramatically and dismissively. "Oh, Audrey, you know. She's probably still deciding which shade of beige to wear. She'll be along. Don't worry. I had her thoroughly styled. She might even be recognizable tonight." He winked, and the men around him shared a knowing chuckle. He felt a familiar prickle of irritation. He just hoped she wouldn't actively embarrass him. He poured himself a glass of champagne and stood near the grand staircase, the main entry point to the ballroom where he could hold court. He was engrossed in conversation with Marcus Cross, their talk a polite dance of veiled insults and power plays, when a sudden silence fell over the usually noisy lobby. It wasn't an abrupt quiet, but a growing wave of stillness as conversations broke off and heads began to turn one by one toward the entrance. A murmur of whispers followed. Julian, annoyed by the interruption, looked impatiently toward the staircase. And then he saw her. For a moment, his brain simply refused to process the image. He saw a woman descending the grand marble stairs, and his first thought was that she must be a movie star, or perhaps European royalty he hadn't been briefed on. She moved with a liquid grace, her hand gliding lightly on the railing. The dress, a breathtaking creation of midnight blue silk, seemed to absorb the light around her, creating an aura of mystery and power. It wasn't revealing, yet it clung to a surprisingly slender, strong figure. Her deep chestnut hair caught the light, framing a face with sculpted cheekbones and a determined, yet serene expression. But it was her eyes that held the room captive. They were large, intelligent, and scanned the crowd with a quiet, certain gaze. There was no shyness or apology in them. They held a silent, formidable power. Julian felt a strange, unfamiliar clench in his chest. He narrowed his eyes slightly, a flicker of confusion crossing his features. There was something in the line of her jaw, the shape of her eyes. Marcus Cross, standing beside him, let out a low whistle. "My God," he murmured, his usual cynical mask dropping for a second. "Now that is a woman, is it? Who is she?" The woman reached the foot of the staircase. The cameras, which had been focused on a famous actress, swiveled toward her in a frantic, unified motion, the sound of shutters clicking like hail. She didn't flinch. She didn't pose. She simply paused, her eyes continuing their quiet survey of the room. And then her gaze landed on Julian. She held his eyes for a single, charged second. A ghost of a smile, enigmatic and cold, touched her lips. It was in that smile that Julian's world tilted on its axis. Recognition slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. The air left his lungs. The champagne flute in his hand suddenly felt heavy. Audrey. It was Eleanor, his simple, invisible, beige wife. But it couldn't be. The woman standing before him was a goddess, a queen. She moved with an authority he had never seen. The ash-brown hair was gone. The bland clothing was gone. The downcast eyes and apologetic posture were gone. Every trace of the woman he had so casually ridiculed and dismissed had been annihilated. In her place stood this stunning stranger, who wore his wife's face. "Julian, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost," Marcus Cross said, a note of amusement in his voice. He followed Julian's stunned gaze, and his eyebrows rose in disbelief. "Wait a minute. Is that Audrey?" Julian couldn't answer. He was completely, utterly mute. His mouth was dry, his mind a whirlwind of confusion, and a strange, terrifying new emotion. Awe. He watched, frozen, as several of the city's most powerful men he had been trying to impress all night, began to move toward her. Their expressions were of admiration and intense curiosity. She greeted them with a subtle nod and a warm yet reserved smile. Her voice when she spoke was not the whisper he was used to, but a low, melodious tone that carried easily. He had wanted her to be presentable. He had wanted her to be an accessory. But this was no accessory. This was a supernova. And she hadn't just entered the room. She had claimed it. The post-mortem. A question of ownership. The rest of the night played out like a fever dream for Julian. He felt as if he had been relegated to the role of spectator in his own event, watching a drama he didn't understand, starring a woman he thought he knew. He saw his wife, this new, incredible Audrey, move through the gala's glittering crowd, not with the timid uncertainty he expected, but with the composure of a seasoned diplomat. Before he could recover from his initial shock and cross the room to her, she was intercepted by Marcus Cross. Julian watched his jaw tighten as his main rival took Audrey's hand, leaning in slightly to kiss her knuckles in a gesture of old-world gallantry. "Audrey," Marcus said, his voice laced with genuine admiration. "I must confess I barely recognized you. You are absolutely magnificent." Julian expected Audrey to blush, to stammer, to shrink under the attention. Instead, she inclined her head gracefully. "Thank you, Marcus. It's amazing what a change of perspective can do." Her response was smooth, witty, and held a subtle double meaning that clearly didn't escape Cross, who laughed appreciatively. Julian headed towards them, a possessive, primal instinct kicking in. This was his wife. What was Cross doing? But as he approached, Audrey turned to greet Robert Delano, the notoriously reclusive tech billionaire. Julian had been trying to secure a meeting with Delano for months. Now his wife was speaking to him as if they were old friends. "Mr. Delano," she said, her voice clear and calm. "I was fascinated by your firm's recent acquisition of the AI logistics firm, Omnicorp. Their predictive modeling is revolutionary, but I imagine the real challenge will be integrating their volatile codebase with your existing infrastructure." Delano, a man who notoriously despised small talk, looked at her with genuine surprise and interest. "You follow AI logistics?" "I follow smart investments," Audrey replied smoothly. "And that was one of the smartest I've seen all year." Julian froze. He had no idea she even knew what AI logistics was. He watched in astonishment as she and Delano engaged in a spirited technical conversation, Delano nodding eagerly. The powerful, the influential, and the socialites around them were drawn into her orbit, not just by her stunning looks, but by the palpable intelligence and confidence she radiated. He felt a hot surge of something ugly and unfamiliar. Jealousy. It was quickly followed by an even more unsettling feeling: irrelevance. She wasn't seeking him out. She didn't seem to need his validation or his presence. She was building her own connections, hogging her own spotlight. He finally managed to corner her near the terrace. "Audrey," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "What is all this? What did you do to yourself?" She turned to face him. Her hazel eyes were cold and direct. The look in them was not that of a wife greeting her husband, but of a stranger assessing an obstacle. "I decided to wear something other than beige, Julian. I thought you'd be pleased." "Pleased? This is a disguise, a ridiculous stunt," he hissed, trying to regain control. He reached out to grab her arm, his old habit of physically directing her kicking in. She stepped back half a pace, just enough for his hand to fall into empty space. The rejection was subtle, but absolute. "Is it?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Or is it possible that the woman you lived with for 3 years was the disguise, and this is the first time you are seeing the real me?" He was stunned. He had no reply. He was accustomed to her complaints, to her silence. This serene, articulate challenge was completely unnerving. "People are watching," he grumbled, trying a different tactic. "You're making a spectacle." "Am I?" She glanced around the ballroom. "The only person I see making a spectacle, Julian, is you. Everyone else seems to be having a wonderful time." She gave him another one of those small, enigmatic smiles. "Now, if you'll excuse me, the curator of the Guggenheim wants to discuss a possible donation. I believe he's a friend of my father's." She turned and walked away, leaving him alone and exposed. The Emperor had no clothes, and for the first time in his life, Julian Black felt foolish. He had spent years mocking the quiet woman by his side, while a queen lay dormant. Tonight she had awakened, and in doing so, had completely rewritten the rules of his world. He was no longer the sun around which she orbited. He was just another planet, suddenly knocked off its axis, watching her chart her own course across the sky. The fear that had been a spark was now a raging fire. He hadn't just underestimated her. He had lost something he didn't even know he had. The confession and the truth unveiled. The days that followed were a slow, agonizing post-mortem. The city buzzed, but not about him or his company's sponsorship. They buzzed about Audrey Blackwood. Society pages, which had never featured her, were now filled with breathless descriptions of the mysterious woman who had captivated the Zenith Gala. Photos of her were everywhere, serene, elegant, and devastatingly stunning. They called her transformation miraculous, dazzling, the debut of the decade. For Julian, every headline was another twist of the knife. He returned to the penthouse after the gala, expecting. He didn't know what. A confrontation, an explanation. Instead, he found nothing. Audrey's room was silent. The door closed. The next morning, she was gone before he woke up. A brief, formal note lay on the marble kitchen island. "I'll be staying at my mother's old apartment in the city for a while. My assistant will coordinate with yours if anything is required." The cold fury that rose in him was a defense mechanism against the deeper, terrifying feeling of complete confusion. This wasn't the woman he married. This wasn't the deal he made. He had to understand. He treated the problem like any business threat. He launched an investigation. His first call was to David Sands, his discreet, ruthlessly efficient head of security. "I want to know everything Audrey has been doing for the last 6 months," he ordered. "Every phone call, every credit card transaction. I want to know who was behind this circus." The first report landed on his desk in 48 hours and only deepened the mystery. There was no registered stylist. The dress had been custom ordered directly from an Antwerp designer, paid for from a private bank account Julian didn't recognize. The hair and makeup artists were freelancers who had signed ironclad NDAs. But one name appeared with intriguing frequency: Isabel Ricci, the legendary image consultant who had disappeared from public life a decade ago. The financial report was even more shocking. David had managed to trace the bank account from which the dress was paid. It was part of a private brokerage account in Audrey's maiden name, Vance, an account Julian had dismissed years ago. He accessed the portfolio, his access as her husband giving him the authority he needed. And his breath caught. It wasn't pocket money. It was a fortune. The initial inheritance, a few million, had been cultivated with astonishing skill. She had invested early in obscure tech firms that had since exploded. She had shorted a failing retail giant months before its public collapse. She had diversified into green energy and pharmaceuticals with the foresight of a seasoned Wall Street predator. Her portfolio had grown exponentially, now rivaling the net worth of some of the men he considered his peers. She was, in her own right, independent and astoundingly wealthy. He felt a wave of vertigo. He had been calling her an accountant while she was quietly playing the market like a virtuoso. He had lectured her about her limited black card while she amassed a fortune he didn't even know existed. The power dynamic he had taken for granted was a complete fiction. She didn't need him. She hadn't needed him for a long, long time. Driven by a new, desperate need for answers, Julian did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He investigated his own past. He called a contact, an old-school private investigator, and asked him to research the Vance family, specifically Audrey's life before their marriage. The story the investigator pieced together was one of silent tragedy. The Vances had once been more than just wealthy. They were socially prominent. But when Audrey was a teenager, her father had become embroiled in a nasty, very public insider trading scandal. Though he was eventually exonerated, the media frenzy was merciless. The paparazzi pursued the family, camping outside their mansion. One particularly aggressive photographer had caused a car accident that severely injured her mother, Catherine, an injury she never fully recovered from, leading to a dependence on painkillers that would eventually contribute to her early death. The trauma had profoundly changed Audrey. She had been brilliant, vibrant, and on the cusp of a shining career. But the predatory nature of the public eye, the way her family was torn apart for sport, had led her to hide. Her plainness, her stillness, her invisibility. It wasn't her nature. It was a fortress. She had deliberately built a shell around herself, a defense mechanism to ensure no one would ever look at her, judge her, or hurt her again. Julian hung up the phone, the investigator's words echoing in the silent office. He felt a deep, wrenching shame. He hadn't just mocked her for being plain. He had mocked her armor. He had belittled the very walls she had built to shield herself from the kind of brutal public world he reveled in. He had been the monster she was hiding from, and he had been living in her house. His phone buzzed. It was an alert from his legal department. Marcus Cross's company, Cross Consolidated, had just filed a formal proposal for a joint venture. It wasn't addressed to Blackwood Holdings. It was a multi-billion-dollar green energy initiative, and the proposal was addressed directly to Ms. Audrey Vance, CEO of EV Capital, the formal name of her private investment firm. Cross hadn't just admired her at the gala. He had recognized her power, and he was now treating her as an equal, a formidable player in a game Julian thought was his own. The final piece of his superiority crumbled. 7. The confrontation and the unclothed truth. Armed with the devastating truth of his own ignorance, Julian knew he couldn't let this play out through assistants and lawyers. He drove to the address on Audrey's note, a classic, elegant brownstone in the Upper East Side that felt a world away from the cold modernity of his penthouse. It felt like her, discreet, solid, and possessing a quiet, hidden strength. She opened the door herself. She wore no evening gown or expert makeup. She was dressed in simple black trousers and a soft cashmere sweater, her hair pulled back loosely. Yet the timid woman was gone forever. The confidence she had worn at the gala was still there now, a quiet, unbreakable core of her being. She looked at him not with anger, but with a quiet, assessing distance. "Julian," she said, her voice even, "I wasn't expecting you. May I come in?" he asked. The words felt strange, humbling. He had never had to ask permission to enter a room in his own home. She hesitated for a second, then stepped aside. The apartment was filled with books, warm wood, and comfortable furniture. It was a home, not a showroom. It was her. He didn't know where to start. The arrogance that had been his default setting all his life had abandoned him. "The gala," he began, his voice rough. "Audrey, He trailed off. She finished for him, an ironic, sad smile on her lips. "That was the point. For one night, I wanted you to see me, to truly see me. I was a fool," he said. The admission cost him more than any failed business deal. "A cruel, blind fool. I read the reports, Audrey, about your finances, about your family, about what happened to my mother." Her calm expression wavered for a moment, a flicker of old pain in her eyes. "You made me investigate. I had to understand," he pleaded, taking a step closer. "I had to know who the woman I married truly was. The things I said to you, the way I treated you. I called your shield a weakness because I was too arrogant to see what it was. I am profoundly sorry." The apology hung in the air between them. It was genuine, torn from a place of deep shame. Audrey listened, her gaze steady. She walked to a small mahogany desk and picked up a thick manila envelope. She offered it to him. "I am sorry too, Julian," she said softly. "I'm sorry I allowed myself to be invisible for so long. I'm sorry I let my fear dictate my life. I'm sorry that our marriage was nothing more than a cage for both of us." He took the envelope. His fingers felt numb as he opened the flap and saw the legal letterhead. Divorce papers. His heart sank. "No," he whispered. "Audrey, no, I see you now. I swear to God I see you. Let's start over. Let me get to know the real you, the woman who can captivate a ballroom and outmaneuver Wall Street. Let me earn a place in your life." She shook her head, not with malice, but with a soft, final resolve. "This is not punishment, Julian, and it is not a negotiation tactic. It is a declaration. I am no longer the woman who signed that marriage contract. That Audrey Vance is gone. I spent 3 years in your shadow, and I am finally ready to stand in my own." He looked at the papers. Then he looked back at her face, truly seeing the intelligence, the strength, and the resilience etched there. He had owned a diamond and treated it like a common stone, only realizing its value when it was no longer his. The irony was crushing, and the master of acquisitions had failed the most important merger of his life. "Is there no chance?" he asked, his voice cracked with a vulnerability that surprised them both. "The old me would have been afraid to leave," she said, her voice filled with a newfound peace. "The new me is afraid not to. I have a business to run. Marcus Cross just proposed a very interesting joint venture." She allowed a small, confident smile. "I have a life to build. My own life." She didn't ask him to leave, but he knew it was time to go. He stood there for a moment longer, the divorce papers a dead weight in his hand, memorizing the face of the incredible woman he had so carelessly discarded. He had wanted to leave her speechless, but in the end, she was the one who had silenced him. Not with address, but with her quiet, unassailable strength. He walked out of her home and drove back to the city, a city that suddenly felt like it belonged more to her than to him. The story hadn't ended. He knew it. But for the first time, he was not the one writing it. Audrey Vance held the pen, and her first chapter was only just beginning. The Horizon of Audrey, Epilogue. 6 months passed. The seasons in New York changed, but the shift in the city's power structure was more dramatic than the changing leaves in Central Park. The name Blackwood still inspired respect in boardrooms, but the name Vance now evoked something more potent: intrigue. Audrey did not return to the golden cage on Park Avenue. The divorce was finalized with a discreet efficiency that was characteristic of her new life. There were no messy tabloid battles or public recriminations. Audrey's terms were simple. She wanted none of Julian's fortune. She only wanted a clean break, leaving her free to continue building her own. This act, more than anything else, solidified her status as a figure of immense, independent strength in the eyes of the public and the financial world. Her firm, EV Capital, moved into a sleek office in the newly developed Hudson Yards district, a space of light, glass, and cutting-edge design. It was the architectural opposite of Julian's opulent, heavy penthouse. Here, she thrived. Her joint venture in green energy with Marcus Cross, dubbed Helios, was a resounding success. They were acquiring land, laying groundwork, and attracting investors drawn not just by the project's profitability, but by Audrey's formidable reputation, her meticulous research, and her ethical investment strategy. Her partnership with Marcus was one of deep intellectual respect. He was a sharp businessman, but he constantly found himself impressed by her ability to see angles he had overlooked, to calculate risks with a quiet precision that bordered on the prophetic. Their meetings were a rapid-fire exchange of ideas, data, and strategy. Meanwhile, Julian Black lived in the echo of his former life. The vast penthouse, once a symbol of his dominion, now felt like a mausoleum. The silence was immense. He had tried to fill it at first, hosting parties and bringing home the kind of beautiful, shallow women he once preferred. But he found their conversation empty, their laughter irritating. They weren't her. They lacked the depth, the hidden fire, the quiet intelligence he had been blind to for so long, and now craved with a desperate pang. He saw her, of course. It was impossible not to. He saw her on the cover of Forbes, profiled as the quiet titan of Wall Street. He saw paparazzi photos of her leaving a conference in Geneva, looking effortlessly chic in a tailored pantsuit, her expression focused and serene. He saw her being interviewed on financial news channels, speaking with an eloquence and authority that squeezed his heart with a mix of pride and profound loss. One night, he was watching from his car. Stuck in traffic on Fifth Avenue. A digital billboard above him lit up. It was an advertisement for the Helios initiative. It showed a pristine image of a wind farm at sunrise, and at the bottom, the corporate logos, Cross Consolidated and EV Capital, his rival and his ex-wife building the future together. He finally understood. He had spent his life acquiring things, companies, buildings, assets. He had treated Audrey as his ultimate acquisition, and in his arrogance, he had never bothered to look inside the wrapping paper. He had owned a treasure and let it slip through his fingers because he was too foolish to recognize its worth. Julian looked from the billboard, from his name in lights, to his own reflection in the polished window of his limousine. He saw a man who had everything and nothing. He had the money, the power, the skyline, but he was completely, utterly alone. Miles away, in her own office, Audrey was standing by the window, looking at the same city. She didn't see a collection of buildings he owned. She saw a network of opportunities, a future she was building on her own terms. The last 3 years had been a quiet, painful winter. But now it was spring, and everything was beginning to grow. She took a sip of tea, a small, genuine smile on her face, and returned to her work. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the city. But in her world, it felt like dawn. Final reflection and call to action, closing. The story of Audrey Vance is a powerful reminder that the quietest people often have the most to say, and that true strength is not about the noise you make, but about the changes you inspire. She transformed not only her appearance, but her destiny, proving that self-worth is the most impressive accessory of all. She didn't need a prince to save her. She just needed to remember that she was always a queen. What part of her transformation did you find most powerful? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And for more unforgettable stories of resilience and redemption, don't forget to share this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring these incredible narratives to light. Thank you for listening.